First, sorry to make everybody get up early, and sorry to Linda to get this too early. But it is my great honor today to introduce our OARDC guest speaker, Dr. Linda Lobao. Dr. Linda Lobao is the professor of Eurosociology and Geography in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at OSU. She is also the chair of the Eurosociology graduate program. Dr. Lobao's research centers on the effect of state and market forces on the socio-economic well-being of populations across regions and communities. So, as mentioned, this speech is sponsored by the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center. And very welcome, Dr. Linda Lobao.
Thank you guys for inviting me. It's been a real honor to be able to talk here today. I do want to mention one thing. I'm a sociologist, and so hopefully this talk will interest you, but I'm not. In trying to prepare for it, I was sort of in a quandary about, like, well, what will they really be interested in? So I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff, and then hopefully we'll have some time later if you have any questions. So I'm going to be talking about poverty in place across the United States and focusing on the subnational scale. So poverty, or the hardship of having insufficient income, given the context in which you live, is a worldwide problem. And it has a legacy of being studied in large literatures across the social sciences. So it's the study of poverty is very interdisciplinary. But, this goes, so we So conventionally, however, poverty tends to be studied across the social sciences at a couple of different spatial scales. So we have this huge urban scale literature across the social sciences, and a lot of it looks at poverty within neighborhoods, across neighborhoods, and this literature is basically called the neighborhood effects literature. It's a large urban literature, and I've given you a classic citation here if you are interested in looking at this type of work, but it uses census tracts and stuff like that. And then there's also a lot of literature at the cross-national scale, where, another example, classic example, where we look at poverty, measured in, various different ways, GDP, GNP per capita, income inequality. So this huge literature is looking at this issue. By poverty, I also want to say that I'm talking about the general issue of economic well-being. And I'm using poverty because, well, it's in the United States, it's a wonderful variable to use if you're working with U.S. data. It's consistent, the measure's consistent. Then there are problems with the poverty measure, obviously, but it's a great sort of shorthand here for looking at well-being. And also want to say that even though the maps I'm going to be showing you today are all poverty rate maps, that they map quite closely to other indicators of socioeconomic well-being, like unemployment, median household income, median family income, per capita income. So when I talk about poverty, please keep in your mind that I'm talking about the general issue of well-being across places, economic well-being. Just to give you a point of reference in terms of the current poverty rate, the poverty threshold for one person in 2011 for a one-person household is about $12,000 a year, and for a four-person household is about $23,000 a year. And so the threshold is, gearing the United States to family size, person size, and age. So let me show you what I'm talking about in terms of poverty at the subnational scale. Here are this is just simply the poverty rates for each of the four census decades. And we just simply code, this is a very simple map, so we just simply coded these maps, you know, bottom 33%, middle 33%, top 33%. And so it gives you a sense of where, you know, where poverty is in the United States. And I'll show you some Moran's eyes clustering maps later. But, you know, what's interesting, right, is just despite 4 decades, to me, okay, I'm a sociologist, so I don't, you know, I don't study these patterns in the depth that you do, but for me, you still see this north-south pattern, right? Despite decades of industrial restructuring, where would you want to live in the United States, right? In the north. And then here's what most of our current data look like in terms of the poverty rates. And most of these maps that I'll be showing you later were done by Michael Betts, who's in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Development Economics here at Ohio State. And he is a postdoc on our projects. The other thing I want to say is that this work is done with a lot of other researchers here, but primarily Mark Partridge, Michael Betts, and there are others also that are involved. So this basically is the poverty rate at post-recession. So an overview of this presentation, I want to talk about why this type of work is significant for research and policy, the existing body of work that's out there on this subnational scale. So we're looking at, again, poverty not at the urban area, not at the cross-national, but I know you would call it regional, but this is an issue when one talks across the social sciences. If you talk about regions in sociology, no one's going to understand you. They're going to think you're talking about Appalachia, the South, you know, regions that have names to them, that are historical regions. And when you talk about general regional processes in sociology, very few people would be able to understand what you mean. You'd have to talk about spatial processes or things like that. So there is, one of the things I will talk about is how for you to make an impact across disciplines too. And some of these issues were raised earlier, but the language has to be adapted when you start working across disciplines. So I'm going to talk about the importance for this work, looking at the Great Recession decade, looking at some of the, what we can do in terms of policies and local governments. Some of this work, it's interesting, I was listening to Phil's presentation yesterday, overlaps with some of the things that Phil was saying, you know, that you see in the OECD countries. So why is this type of work, you know, trying to explain these patterns, you know, what determines them, why they change over time, what are the causal factors involved? I noted that this reflects a knowledge gap across the social sciences, and we noted that already, and it allows for the bridging of social science disciplines. So if you are working on this type of topic, you inherently run into interdisciplinary research and are citing it and are working with it. And in order to try to move this research forward, a number of us got together and wrote a white paper for NSF. NSF was asking for white papers, like what's the future of social science research at NSF. And so it's this whole rebuilding mosaic. So if you are interested in where social science research is going in the future in the United States, I would take a look at that rebuilding the mosaic. Not necessarily our piece is in there, but if you want to see what the hot topics projected to be in the future are in terms of funding, I would go to that site. I'm trying to convince you of the importance of doing work in this area. Okay, so why is this area significant? It's also the site of pressing questions. If we look at that scale of trying to look at poverty at this particular scale, it's a very important scale for answering and trying to understand many of the questions that we have in the social sciences. So the persistence of long-standing poverty, which you saw, I think, in those maps, but I'll show you again, show you in a moment in more detail. Trying to study more recent patterns of income polarization in the regions, the impacts of the Great Recession and recovery. So these are just some of the issues that I think are pressing that if you take a look at poverty at the scale that you will be able to address. Other examples are the impacts of climate change, such as the development of new energy sources and shale gas. I mean, we're looking at the impact. A number of us are looking at the impacts of mining, of the energy industry. What are those impacts on poverty, on growth, immigrant populations regionally, investment, divestment by international firms, and then decentralization of government across the globe. And as well as in the United States, government has tended to be decentralized over time. And my impression is in the EU nations, that decentralization tends to be viewed more positively because it gives local people more voice. So I may be wrong about that, but my impression is that relative to how decentralization is viewed in the United States, we're a free-to-starve nation, right? We have a very weak social safety net, which is one of the major differences that the EU nations don't. They have much, much stronger social safety net. And so in the United States, decentralization means doing more with less. And it means potential, we'll devolve some funds, but we tend to devolve funds, we tend to devolve responsibilities and less so funding to do those responsibilities. So in the United States, decentralization has been looked at because we're highly decentralized anyways. We're one of the most highly decentralized nations in terms of governments, in developing, relative to other developed nations. But the decentralization has continued to proceed in the United States, and with really potentially negative consequences now that we see post-recession and all these cuts into local governments. So I'll get back to that. But looking at the scale is also very useful for trying to extend theory. It's a site for testing theory developed in other spatial scales. And so for me personally, I am not so interested in regional processes per se. What I'm interested in is social science theory and how can I apply it to a scale of understanding that that other sociologists and social scientists have not really looked at. And I'm trying to say, in my work, I'm trying to say a lot about the big questions that we have in social science and using the subnational scale as a platform for testing them. So all of these issues that you might want to look at, like, does economic growth create inequality? Does greater inequality, is that better for economic growth? These types of issues can be tested at the subnational scale. And so in terms of also policy, another reason for looking at the scale is if you're interested in policy, well, almost all, major policy, our programs at the federal level are geared to a spatial understanding of poverty. Places are targeted based on their poverty is always one of the major indicators in any measure of whether an area gets funding or not. And so an example is the Appalachian Regional Commission, and if you're interested in this, we go over all of the indicators that are used to measure distress, and not surprisingly, in the Appalachian Regional Commission, which was established in the mid-1960s, right after during Johnson's war on poverty era, and poverty is a key measure in their distress index. But not surprisingly, all of these counties that are really not distressed want to be a part of it. So you get these places in New York that, pretty well off, but they want to be part of the Appalachian. They want to have a high distress index so that they can get funding. And so, anyways, these are just some Moran's eyes. The other census that I had shown you, another iteration of. These are just basically local Moran's eyes. We don't show the negative spatial autocorrelation, just the positive here. But I think what it does, it shows you this, this clustering and where policy is aimed. And is there a little pointer on? Oh, is that a little red thing a pointer?
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Okay. Okay, so you can see. Okay, this part here is Appalachia, right? So this part here is Appalachia, and so you can see in 1970. At the start of the Appalachian Regional Commission, what that little spot looks like and how that has sort of changed over time. Still high poverty. The other place so Appalachian Regional Commission is, the other thing is the United States has very little in the way of regional policy that reaches across the nation. What we have is farm policy, defense policy that have spatial. Farm policy was supposed to be the rural development policy, but under 2% of Americans are farmers, so it doesn't really make sense. But that's our. We do not have well-planned, well-thought-out rural development policy. And also, if you look at the map of the United States, you should realize, and I'm sure that you do, is that about 3/4 of this land area is rural. Most of this is rural that we're looking at here. The other thing, the other place for policy is this area of former plantation agriculture. It's alternately called, it's called the Southern Crescent. It's also called the Black Belt. And it's another area of long-standing, persistent poverty in the United States. And one of my former advisors, when I was in graduate school, he lobbied, and actually, it's quite amazing to think about this, an academic sort of lobbying, getting Congress people together, and he was able to get these different bills signed in Congress that have allowed for the creation of some Southern Crescent Black Belt Commission that is very much like the Appalachian Regional Commission, except that they never gave funding to it. We were in a different era, post-Reagan era, whereas we were in a much more generous historical era when Appalachian Regional Commission was starting. And of course, so I'm trying to convince you about why this is very important to look at. Okay, and this is, of course, this is just sort of the Occupy. This is a PR piece poster that Occupy puts out, and so just the whole issue of poverty, inequality itself, is very important across, not just at the academic level, but obviously, across the United States. And I just think this is kind of neat because it shows, sort of a parallel with what we're showing here in terms of the maps. So I'm going to talk to you about the body of existing research that we have out there. So this research, it spans the social sciences. It has a thematic concern with factors explaining economic disparities, poverty rates, income inequality. But more than that, can be education, all kinds of political participation, any kind of well-being indicator that you can think of, this research has explored. But there are a set of common determinants that this work tends to use. And those are determinants of economic structure, quality and quantity of employment, demographic attributes that reflect the population's vulnerability to poverty, and then geographic context, regional context. the types of work that you're most familiar with. There are a standard set of methodological protocols that people use when they do this research, and counties, for better or worse, are the most commonly used units of analysis. For a variety of reasons. There's lots of data on them. They really are units of government, so they can do things. And they're probably the best way of capturing rural America because they include incorporated places. And they also function like labor markets. I mean, labor markets are basically, we have labor market areas, and they're basically aggregates of counties. Metro areas are basically aggregates of counties. And so the counties have a lot of advantage for studying sub-state relationships. And then there are the quantitative studies use various types of regression models, and we've become more sophisticated over time in those types of models. So publications there's a lot of work out there if you're interested in this, and here is just some examples of publications that review this work. Amy Glassmeyer's work, that little atlas is a descriptive thing, but her Progress in Human Geography article is pretty good at reviewing that literature. And then we have a volume on this kind of thing with Mark Partridge and Dan Rickman. There's a lot of work on rural poverty, and Bruce Weber et al. have a piece on that. And Rebecca Blank, in the same issue, of International Regional Science Review, there are a number of articles on this literature. And Rebecca Blank has got a really good article. I just couldn't fit her onto the slide, but she's got a really good article that reviews the determinants of, the problems with this kind of work. And so some of the journals that would be interested in publishing this work, you have the journals that, that we had the nice discussion yesterday about, where you ought to be aiming your research, some high quality, some, different types of quality. But I just was throwing up some of the journals where you see some of this work that they're more amenable to others about this. And Social Science Quarterly, if you want to make an inroad across the social sciences in general, Social Science Quarterly is pretty visible. And some of this work, some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff is what sociologists would call atheoretical. And for us, atheoretical has nothing to do with math. It's got all to do with the abstractness of the research question and the contribution to the big body of literature. And so a lot of this is not really theoretical. Some of the stuff is not really theoretical. I have to plug, I'm one of the co-editors of Cambridge Journal, Regions, Economy, and Society. And, I think we try to do a good job of doing both theoretical as well as empirical stuff. So, but we are a special issue type of journal, so we have calls for special issues. You don't just submit to it, but there are calls for special issues. So there's a number of limitations with this work. The research is still in development, still being routinized, which is in flux. So you can get reviewers that are not quite sure what you're doing, or they if a research body of research is not consolidated, then you can get off the wall in terms of reviews. Theorizing power, that's a central concern, I think, in some parts of human geography, and it is central to sociology. And so for me, when I read some of the regional science literature, I don't see a lot of power. By power, what I mean is, concern with the idea that there are different class interests, and like, why do we get the spatial economy that we have? Why do we get different poverty rates across places? Well, part of this is political decision making. There are different interest groups that want these conditions, and so this issue of power, to me, we see this more in the sociological and some of the geography work and looking at these poverty, but not so much in some of the other There's also limited focus on the determinants of poverty. Most of the research is looking at, what does industrial structure, different types of industries, what are their impacts on poverty, and relatively little on the role of government. There are a bunch of common methodological issues, and we can talk about these later. I'm not sure about the time, by the way, because we should have said an hour, but I don't know what you...
It's okay, still have like 20 minutes or 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah.
I thought I had an hour. Oh, because we started late?
Yeah, you're okay on time.
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah.
We have until like 10, right?
But I can skip through this. Like we said yesterday, even talk fast. So there are these common methodological issues like modeling processes, data availability, unit of analysis fit with the research question. So, you have a research question at hand. Are counties really the right unit of analysis you want to use? Are metro areas really the right unit? You exclude a lot of the United States just focusing on metro areas. So what I want to do is basically that I hope that you have been convinced, though, that we ought to be looking at some of these issues. And so I want to give you three empirical examples of how we have looked at poverty across the United States at this particular scale. First, the Great Recession period, what could research tell us about how places and populations fared? And then the second part is what can governments do about this? And as I mentioned before, the United States is very highly decentralized and this federal gridlock at the national level, and almost by default, we've had to rely on states and communities for some of our most progressive policies. If you think about where living wage legislation comes from, where even currently today gay and lesbian marriage comes from, this stuff, some of these progressive policy experiments come from states and localities, not from the federal government. And this is very different from in the past, where the federal government was a leader in progressive policy. If you think about the civil rights movement during the 1960s, and then all sorts of federal programs that came from the New Deal during Franklin Roosevelt's administration during the Depression. Most of our progressive policy in the past came from the federal level. Well, obviously that's changed over time, and President Obama himself prescribes to this perspective called progressive federalism, where the idea is that local communities and states are the ones that need to lead the way, and not the federal government in terms of policy. So what I want to do then is look at the current period and some of the work that we're doing. And this is basically exploratory because we've just begun to do some of these analyses. So what I'm going to show you is just poverty from the 1990 period, 2 decades of poverty maps. Go through them really quickly. Okay, this is the poverty rate in the United States, and these maps use the same metrics, the same cutoff points over time, so you can see the changes in the colors of the maps over time. So here's where we start in the 1990s.
So by the same cutoffs, do you mean like percentages of
Yeah.
the poverty level that changes every year?
No, well, we're not showing changes here. I'll show you just cross-sectional, and then I'll show a change map. So this is just the high poverty is in red, and then it goes down to low poverty.
Yeah.
And each of the maps, you'll see, uses the same cutoff point. So 35%,
Yeah, so it's percentages of the poverty rate, not income levels.
No, it's the poverty rate. It's the proportion. Yeah, it's the proportion of that population in poverty.
Sure.
So, in the cut, behind the red will be the over 35% area. So as the colors go down. So this is So anyway, at any rate, and then Mike Betts, who's our postdoc, on this, did these maps. In the old days, you used to have to get geography here at Ohio State to do these maps. And we have one of the top geography departments in the country here, but you probably know that. But nowadays, like, anybody can, not anybody, but normal people can do these kinds of maps. So at any rate, this is the beginning of a very prosperous decade. Okay, so look at the green and the red here. Okay, and then look at this. Nice, right? This is what you want to see. Green. So this is again the same. Okay, got some red in there. So a nice prosperous decade. We were all very.
Yeah, sorry. Because I'm so ignorant about poverty in the US, but that part of Texas, is it because there are a lot of Mexicans?
Yeah, it's the those are the areas where they have what do you call them? Colony ice. The high you have the they're Mexican Mexican American citizens, but there's a lot of migrant labor that goes. That's a historical place where they've lived. Yeah. And then up there, the Native American reservations. So, at any rate, what I'm trying to show you here is that over the 90s, there was a really prosperous decade, great decade for the United States. For rural areas, the poverty gap, which has always been historically much higher in the United States, in rural areas, began to close, and it was a great time for rural America. And then here we start to. This is right prior to the recession. You can see there's a little bit more contraction here, more yellow. We did go through 9/11, and 9/11 a little bit contraction right after that, and then this is sort of we're getting to the right up to the recession, and so things are changing, and then you can see the colors again. So again, we're getting. So this is what nice and green, right? A little more yellow, and a little bit more, probably we did this, later there'd even be higher poverty. But
sorry, Lina, what's the red over there that suddenly appears and before it was very light?
In Oregon.
Yeah.
I don't know. It may have been. I don't know. It may have been the end of the logging industry. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it may be. I mean, that's. Yeah, I really don't. I mean, some of these maps. We don't really know unless we can go into some of them. We can make some generalizations about them, but we will. And then here's the change in the rate. This just simply shows you the change in the rate over the decade. So where poverty really. Yeah.
So this is the poverty. This is the consistent poverty line, because if the government increase the poverty line,
it's just a threshold. So we have a threshold indicator, and so it's a proportion of people below that threshold. So your question is really: are they doing really physically better or worse? Is that really what your question is?
Yeah.
Well, nobody would know. We wouldn't. You wouldn't know that. Our threshold is a measure of absolute deprivation in the United States. It's not subjective measure. It's a measure of objective deprivation, where you don't have enough money to have enough clothes, food, housing for your family.
So it's not your nominal wage or something like.
No.
So it's about.
No, well, I mean, it's control. Inflation is hard. It's the threshold does vary by inflation, but but actually what's happened over time in poverty is that the actual, because it's based on a starvation diet. I mean, the United States is a country where we are free to starve. I mean, we are very different from other developed countries, even different from Canada and Australia. And so our, I'm not sure how they calculate poverty. They probably calculate poverty in a similar manner. But the United States, the poverty threshold is 3 times the starvation diet. And that was determined in 1960. And as poor people in the 60s, and when we set the rate to try to benchmark where the progress we were making, and then when as food has become less expensive or taken less of our proportion of what people spend, that same amount of food is still there. So even though housing costs have gone up, way more, that's still, I think it's about a third of that index. And food is a third of it. Sure.
So you have the
poverty. In percentage points.
Level of income.
It's the actual, so it's like, go from 10 to 11 to 12. It's percentage points.
To 2000. I'm not convinced that.
And so to try to explain these patterns, we've done some what I call exploratory regressions because we're still refining them. And so we're trying to look at this. We're trying to look at some of these. Some of the questions that you have: is this being driven by mining? What is agriculture driving it? Demographic attributes. So we're looking at what are driving some of these changes over the recession decade. And
I think it's the same real.
Maybe go back here. So what we've got your standard, econometric models here. Mark Partridge and Mike Betts. They basically refined these models. So all the standard check-off things that you would like to see. I think that these fixed effects for states. They do basically weight poverty. We do the nearest neighbors. I think he does a queen adjacency or something in terms of weighting nearest neighbors. So all that kind of econometric stuff is done. And I wanted to show you the results. So sorry. When we look at levels of poverty, so we're lagging. We've got our independent variables at year 2000. And then, some of the stuff is you can't get the data in between censuses. Now you can with ACS, but you can't get the rural counties, only the bigger counties every year. And so we're using counties here, and we're looking at what we find is that where employment growth was greater over that decade between 2000 and 2010, we've got different measures of employment growth in that model. Poverty was lower, and the measure of employment growth is from EMSI, which is looks at establishments in the county. So what you can sort of show here is that if you can create jobs, in that county, employment in jobs, companies in that county, you can reduce poverty. And at least in sociology, that often has been questioned because just, you bring in firms, well, does that mean that they're going to hire local residents or not, and are they going to lead to, more inequality? But basically we find that, in fact, job growth does tend to reduce poverty. We find that where manufacturing, professional services are like high-quality services like legal, engineering category. There were no significant relationships. So that, these economic sectors that we've tended to rely on to help us, get through bad, distressed circumstances, they really had no, barriers or no benefits. And mining, where it was higher, there was lower poverty in 2010. So the energy industry, had an impact. In terms of demographic characteristics, relationships are what we would expect from poverty studies. More college educated at the beginning, better outcomes later. Family structure, less single parent households, both men and women single parent households. Lower poverty in the future. The agglomeration factors are interesting because the recession was an era where rural areas fared relatively well and urban areas tended to fare worse. So this is the 2000 to 2010, so the outcome variable here is just 2010 poverty. But let's look at that change. Let's look at change this is change over the recession, and basically where the recession hit hardest in the United States. And so what we find, interestingly, is that where employment growth was strongest at the beginning of the decade, they experienced a greater growth in poverty. Not contemporaneous. If you look at contemporaneous 2007 to 2010 employment growth, yeah, you have reduced poverty. But if you look at the beginning of the decade, these places, the growth places fared worse. Manufacturing employment, where it was greater, and food service, lower wage employment. So we put in some higher wage and low, better quality and lower quality employment sectors. And then no significant relationships between professional services and poverty. So some of these, industries that we rely on or we think about as, okay, these are going to, help our future and create barriers to further distress, are not really working out here. Demographic and education had little effect. The only impact was for associate's degrees, associate degree 2 years of college. Those places where that was higher at the beginning of the year 2000, they had somewhat reduced poverty, but no significant relationship with the proportion of college educated. So again, that didn't affect whether your locality weathered the recession or not. Single-parent male households, not female houses, were related to greater poverty. Age, younger, greater poverty, older, less poverty. So some of these male employment sectors are being hit. And and then agglomeration factors, the same type of thing. These larger metro areas are experiencing greater poverty. These findings, I think, are somewhat similar to a recent study by Gary Sands and Laura Reese, came out in 2013 in Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society, called Fairweather Friends, The Impacts of the Creative Class on the Economic Health of Mid-sized U.S. Metropolitan Areas. So they're looking at metro areas where they find no, creative class, banking on that did not, had no effect on whether the recession or not. And so, I think this goes back to some of the things that Phil was saying yesterday about these standard relationships that we've seen over time seem to have shifted. So try to conclude this part of it, and I've got a whole local government part, and I'll go. I guess I will do the bad thing, and I will rush through the local government part. So I think this research is enabling us to track the performance of economic structures and demographic changes across place, and it sort of shows us where we might need policy interventions. And this kind of work, I would argue, is important both for scholarship, that one can theorize this and publish something, what we intend to do in a major journal, and then of course also for policy. And now that I had mentioned that in the United States, this gridlock at the federal level, progressive policy experiments seem to be coming from the local and state level. So we tended to rely increasingly on local governments for policy to alleviate poverty, place-based policy. And to what degree then, so the question becomes, to what degree are local governments up to the task? If we are moving to a system where we are relying more on decentralized government to alleviate poverty, what can we expect from the performance of local governments? Are they going to be able? Are they up to the task of alleviating poverty or not? So poverty in local governments is policy interest in local governments in both the left and the right side. On the right side, if you look at what some of the Tea Party platform is, it's all decentralized government, and some of it, the real right-wing groups in the United States, it's county government. That the county ought to be the unit of government in the United States.
No government.
Oh, well, that's the next thing. But that's the next thing. That's true. That's the next thing. I'll get to that in a second. So that could be no government. But the Tea Party platform itself is it's very interesting. It's decentralized. So, anyways, shifts of government systems globally. So this has been occurring in Europe for a long time now, a couple decades. New policy experiments and the importance of place-based policy. And by place-based, what we mean is, well, first of all, I should say, so we dichotomize policy between place and people-based, but in fact, a number of research, well, some research has shown that the two really are intermixed, okay? But for the purposes of discussion, you can think of place-based and people-based. Place-based being, investment in your local infrastructure, local business, your local workforce, in your community as a whole. And then people-based, the standard federal policy that we have for alleviating poverty, income transfers, food stamps, things like this. Local governments also have become more important in the United States because stayers, the population migration rates have slowed down, and stayers, we have a higher proportion of stayers, so maybe we ought to be investing in place-based policy more. Okay, so we're focusing on counties here. County governments, they are not just population aggregates, but they're also important units of government. They cover more residents in the United States than municipalities. They are the fastest growing government. They exceed the size of the federal civilian government in terms of employment. Right? Who knew? The size of our county governments are greater than the size of the federal government. And they provide important human services. And they are the most important government for rural people, which is most of that map that you saw. So we have two questions here, and I'll skip to the end of this one because this is an easy one, and then I'll skip to this one, to poverty. So we have two questions here. So given that, we're asking here, does poverty affect the policies that local governments enact? Can local governments make good poverty choices? If they're in poverty, is poverty going to influence policy choices? Do they have the ability to make good policy choices? Alternatively, do local governments, and the second question is, do local governments have any effect on poverty? So, we're arguing, well, maybe there's a place for place-based policy. Well, first of all, do local governments have any effect? Because they're the ones who are probably going to be delivering it. There are no data sources on these questions. We have very terrible government data in the United States. We have something called the Census of Governments, but it's been underfunded, started to be underfunded during the George W. Bush administration, and there's budget data, there's expenditure data, but it can be a real mess. And so at any rate, we worked with David CRAE, who's an economist. We worked with the National Association of Counties, undertook surveys of local officials, which are the common way of getting data on policies that are not available from Census of Governments. And so we've collected all this policy data, in addition to the data that the Census of Governments provides. So I'm going to does poverty prevent local governments from creating policies and programs that might help residents? We explore this in a study that examines the types of economic development and workforce services activities that localities pursue, and we're still working on some of this. So, does poverty have an impact on policies? And I'm not going to go through that. I will just. Oops. I guess I forgot that I had these little things up here. These are some of the. The dependent variable, the policy tools and stuff that we have here. These are some of the measures of policies that we're looking at. We have business attraction policies, standard, smokestack chasing policies. We had new wave sustainable tools, which are like building small business development, business incubators, things like that. And then community support services are services for the workforce, like training, child care, elder care, transportation, stuff like that. So let me just end this. Does poverty, so in this particular study, and again we're doing more work on this, does poverty prevent local governments from creating policies and programs that might help residents? And we find no, that in fact that it doesn't. The capacity is more important. And by capacity it means that they're organized in a way that's more centralized. They're organized in a way they have a central well, their structure is more centralized, more organized, more expert, and poverty does not also affect capacity. So what we see is that these local governments, they vary tremendously, and their capacity varies tremendously, and poverty doesn't seem to have a direct effect on that. That is, even though they may have poor local economic conditions, what they are able to do and how they are able to organize at the local level has more impact than poverty does. This other piece is, do local governments have any effect? And this goes back to what Alina was saying. Do local governments and their policies influence local populations' economic development at all? Do they have any impact on their well-being? And here we're focusing on job growth, poverty rates, and household income. And this just came out, well, last year in International Regional Science Review. And this goes back to the case that Alina was saying. So here's the case for the beneficial effects of local government, that if local governments have stronger institutional capacity, they should be able to reduce poverty. And again, I'm going to go over these quickly and get to the end. And so we're looking here in this particular paper at both institutional capacity and at policy. So we're asking, if you have stronger institutional capacity, do you have lower poverty? If you make the right policy choices, or if you make policy choices that researchers have said are better than others, which are more to the community workforce, you should have better outcomes. So this is a case for beneficial effects, and then there is this case, is what Alina was saying. There is a case for negative or null effects of local government, and that comes from both the right and the left, where the right says government can't do anything good, just get rid of it, who cares about it? And the left itself is also, somewhat down on local governments, because to the left, it's just the federal government, because of all our long-term experiences with civil rights movements and reducing poverty. So at any rate, let me just show you at the end of this. So we do an empirical analysis, we look at all this stuff, all these measures. So in our end results, county government does seem to make a difference. It's not really strong, but nobody else has looked at this. No one else has ever, surprisingly, all of these decades, researchers have been using counties as population aggregates. Nobody asked whether their governments have any effect. And what we find is that more centralized county governments are less fragmented, job growth is greater, that are more autonomous, that they have their own decision-making ability, job growth is greater. Total population and child poverty is lower, where counties are more autonomous, where they're making their own decisions, and median household income is higher, where counties provide a greater number of workforce activities. So if they provide more child care, elder care, poverty rates are lower. Sorry, household income is higher, not poverty rates. But for most policy variables, for direct policy variables, these are capacity. Capacity, more capacity, better conditions. Policy itself, little impact. Capacity, so we conclude here that capacity building is more important than policies, and skepticism is needed about local government's ability to analyze accurately the costs and benefits of policies. So we're looking at, this is a map of what's happened in the post-recession and decline in local governments. Cutbacks in local government. So given that they make a difference, now we're cutting them back and moving research forward. I think I'll stop there. But so we're going to be testing whether local governments have an impact or not. We just received an NSF grant to do that, and Mark Partridge and I, and who else? Oh, Gregory Cook's political sociologist.
We have time for one quick question while we transition. So if anyone has a quick question for Dr. Lobao.
I think we get the question.
Yeah, over here.
Okay, so what Dr. mentioned is that in post-recession period, the single male parent household is actually related to the poverty growth. To my knowledge, the single male parent is actually increasing a lot among the single parents in the past 2 decades. Do you think it's the level of the increase that is driving the poverty growth?
Well, the actual increase is driving it, or the poverty, or are you asking me, or the opposite question, is poverty driving?
So I'm asking that, like in the Russian that we did, in the empirical analysis, are you looking at the increase in the male parents or in the level of the male
It's just the level. It's just so where that level was, where that level was higher, that, and it's probably more a function of, if we had better controls for gender, it's probably just a function of, maybe males, lower earning power, or something like that. If we disaggregated those industrial sectors by gender, we would probably, that could disappear. I don't know. Because even male parent households, their income is much higher than single parent, women, female-headed households. So I think that the increase is simply due to, poor economic conditions. So
it's just for the period between 2007 and 2010. Do you find any income growth?
Yeah, we don't have data on actually the changes of it. We just have what it was like in 2000.